Welcome to Raw Matters, the pilot episode of our long-awaited podcast about the critical minerals that will determine our common future. So today I have here my co-host, Julia Poliscanova. With me, I am Peter Tom Jones of KU Leuven, and together we'll be going through this series of wonderful podcasts. Julia, why are you here?
That's a great question. I just came from maternity leave and thought it would be fun to do something like that. So I'm Julia. I'm now with European climate politics and policies for 2 decades. So I worked across the field in the European governments and local government, and now I'm with Transport and Environment and as TNE. We really want to see a clean transport future, and for us that means electrifying everything we can, so having electric cars, trucks, buses, even planes, hopefully, in our system. But for that to happen, we need a massive acceleration in clean technologies. It's not possible without chargers, without grids, without batteries. So ultimately, I would like to see a clean, sustainable, but resilient clean tech manufacturing sector in Europe.
And you don't like diesel cars?
We don't like diesel cars. Thank God we don't have so many of them anymore. Thanks also in part to the work of organizations like ours. So actually back in 2016, we were a part of the so-called Dieselgate scandal, where we really tried to show just by how much a lot of car makers were cheating or allegedly cheating at the time, and worked tirelessly to change the European regulations. So we changed the testing rules, we changed various emission rules. So today it's simply a lot harder for a diesel car to pass those rules, and because they can't pass those rules, we don't see them on the market. But what about you, Tom? So you're a scientist, you were at KU Leuven. Why, you wanted to be in a great studio. Why is that?
Well, I think as scientists, we also have a responsibility to speak to the people and not just publish papers for the sake of publishing papers. So I like to make documentaries. I like to go on panels in Brussels to speak about critical raw materials. But of course, I do have a background as an environmental and metallurgical engineer, which gives me a bit of technological insight into the extraction, processing, refining, recycling of critical metals. So I look at it also from a scientific point of view. But I do understand that people in general are not really interested purely in the technicalities. They want to hear about the emotional side of the story as well. And that's where the critical raw materials discussion always gets very complicated.
Yes, absolutely. And I have to say, I always admire the way you manage to put the phrases in, right? So you're probably the author of some of the most quoted quotes on minerals, such as "We're walking into the abyss." So I think it's really great to join you in this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to the discussions we're going to have.
I'm certainly a big fan of Life of Brian, Monty Python's film, because I think that is one that really showcases the European situation today. So let's have another meeting for having more action. So that's basically the situation that we always talk in Europe, but we don't seem to get anything done. But that will be the core essence of our podcast, to delve into those
So we
paradoxes.
will talk more about how we need to talk less.
Yeah, but we're going to change how people act also. That's the goal of this podcast.
Agreed.
This is Raw Matters, the podcast about the high-stakes race for the critical minerals that power not only clean energy and mobility, but also digital AI and defense technologies. Join hosts Peter Tom Jones and Julia Poliscanova to explore why the global scramble for critical minerals truly matters.
So, Julia, let's talk about critical raw materials. In 1992, the famous leader in China, Deng Xiaoping, spoke the famous words, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths." This was 1992. At that time, even chemistry students did not know about rare earths because there were the footnotes in the table of Mendeleev, or the periodic table as we call it officially. Fast forward to 2010, and we have the first official rare earth crisis, when China stops the exports of rare earths to Japan. And that's the moment when people also in Europe start realizing, we need critical raw materials for our clean technologies, and we don't have them. We are dependent on third countries like China for the imports of those materials. So when you hear these words, what's your first thought?
I think it's almost a paradox that today in Europe, I think we do talk a lot more and understand how critical critical raw materials are, right? We need them for everything, be it your wind turbine, a solar panel, power grids all around us, or electric cars. But even though we talked about it so much more in the last few years, and we talked a lot more about diversifying the supply, the situation got actually worse, right? So if we look at the facts today, 19 out of 20 critical raw materials are to a large extent controlled by China. They're refining, they're processing, etc. And more than half of all the exports of critical minerals today around the world are subject to some sort of export restriction. So we talk about it, but it's getting worse, right? And while I was on maternity leave, I, of course, was reading the news. It got even worse, right?
So now we're talking about a new situation with Trump coming to power, with Trump weaponizing critical raw materials even further. And we have this huge clash at the moment between the United States and China, and Europe and Canada and Australia. They all seem to be like collateral damage in that huge battle between these two superpowers. And we're getting to see new instruments like export restrictions, export licenses. And furthermore, we also see that these critical metals that we try to have as TNE or as Sky Leuven, we are working for critical metal production for good applications, for clean tech applications, to save the climate, clean energy, clean mobility. But now we're seeing competing uses. Trump is not interested in clean electric vehicles. Trump is interested in rare earths and lithium for defense applications, for robotization, for AI applications. So we see an exploding demand next to the clean tech demand for the same material. So the story is only going to get more complicated.
Yeah, it's going to get more complicated. And if I just want to add here, as TNE and so many NGOs, we looked at it for a while now. It's frustrating how we only look at the supply. Sure, we need more supply, right? And we absolutely need it diversified, etc. But how much more? It doesn't have to be just all like that. The demand question never gets mentioned. You know, do you need a huge SUV versus a smaller car, right? Do you need so many robots and so much of that digitalization? Can we do more with less? I think that and I hope we really delve into that also in one of our episodes, you know, kind of really looking and talking to some experts around, be it recycling or using less. But ultimately, we are in a situation where to build the clean future we want, we will need a lot more critical metals, right? And in the situation with China and their weaponization of minerals, with the situation of the US and what they're doing, the question is, what do middle powers like Europe actually do?
Yeah, we're seeing this really happening in front of our eyes, the fact that these critical metals are being weaponized. We're seeing more and more resource conflicts. We're seeing completely new strategies by the likes of Trump, who's actually become a resource Marxist, in my view, which is very strange, of course, to say that Trump is a Marxist, because from an economic and liberal point of view, he's anything but a Marxist. But when it comes to critical metals, we see that he's using instruments that are being used by state capitalism in China. So it's control, it's minimum prices, price floors, it's state equity in companies. So we're seeing a radical shift, and I have the impression that Europe and many other countries in the world, the middle powers, as they are called, do not really grasp what is happening in front of our eyes.
So I think it is really important for middle powers to be strategic about it. What we have done in Europe a lot is talk about it. We have so many acronyms. We have strategic partnerships. We have memorandums of understanding. More recently, we now have CTIPs, or clean trade and investment partnerships. Plenty of action on talking to the right people, the like-minded partners, right? Be it Chile, be it Australia, be it Canada. What we don't have are actual shovels in the ground to secure projects and mines, also, of course, in a responsible way, because if Europe is involved, if Europe gets some equity in those projects and invests, they can also dictate the conditions under which they're done. And that's what we're missing, actual action as opposed to words.
Well, Europe and Canada and Australia, as I said, they are like becoming collateral damage in this huge power of these massive countries, United States in America, and China, who are really weaponizing this whole CRM conundrum. It's striking to see the recent quote that was provided by Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, in Davos, which is also very interesting in itself, the fact that he had to give that speech in 2026, because I remember another famous speech of a little girl from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, who spoke in 2019 and spoke the famous words, "Your house is on fire." And she gave the speech at Davos. She captured all the media attention. She put climate change really at the top of the political agenda. And now, 7 years later, all of that seems to be forgotten. And now we have Mark Carney, who's giving a totally different type of speech. It was a brilliant speech, but it does show how the world has changed and how the strategy for change is also different today. So let's listen to Mark Carney's speech in Davos.
In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together.
So these are inspirational words. The speech has been viewed millions of times. It has a real impact, almost as much as Greta Thunberg's "Your House is on Fire" speech. What are your first thoughts when you hear this?
So first of all, I think it's a great speech for anyone who is learning how to give a great public speech, by the way. So I think the power of his words was really impressive. I think what he says is very smart, but we need to unpackage that a little bit in terms of what does it mean for Europe, right? As I said, we talked about the diversification of our supply chain in minerals for years. We have a lot of agreements in place and paperwork, but why is it not happening? And to me, there's maybe two things, at least two elements that are missing, and I'd really love to get your take on them as well. So maybe starting with the first one, what we don't have in Europe is any power at either European, maybe national level, but they don't do it, to actually buy equity directly in projects, to go and invest in projects on the ground to get it done. This is what Chinese do so well. The Americans started
Americans
doing
are doing
this.
it now.
Yeah, so why can't we do that? I don't know. What do you see? What's lacking there? Why can't we just go and invest and actually bring the standards in as well?
Because our whole European setup is not designed to allow such risk-taking. Everything that we have in Europe, when we look at DG INPA, for example, and the European Investment Bank, it's always about avoiding risks. So any project that is not certain to be coming to fruition and making a profit, they will say, no, you're not allowed to provide equity for those projects. So we see that all these MOUs that we have signed with these different countries, Canada, Australia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Chile, Argentina, many others. In fact, if you look at the numbers, the actual materials that are transported from those countries to Europe have actually dropped since the signing of these agreements. So rather than boosting the transfer of critical raw materials or refined critical raw materials from those countries, we've actually lost a lot of volumes. So it again shows that there's a huge difference between talking and getting things done in reality.
Exactly. I think we have a little bit of a hope there now, because in its new strategy, the Commission talks about setting up this European Critical Raw Materials Center, which they want to mirror on the Japanese model. They have
JOGMEC,
right, and that works great. It took years, by the way, for JOGMEC to be there, but that's the model. As long as it has some money, it can work. But the second bit around diversification that I think we absolutely don't have, and it's more complicated, is what is the standard or the threshold or common values among which all these like-minded partners will decide who is in and who is out? We talked a lot about ESG, right? So environmental standards. It's really tough to agree something quickly, and we don't have time.
Well, that's also the reason why Carney, in the rest of his speech, speaks about being principled and pragmatic. And I think that combination is absolutely essential. Principled, yes, we want to keep high ESG standards, that's quite evident, but we also have to be some way pragmatic. If we go with our high moral ground to any of those countries in the rest of the world and we demand that they do things exactly like we want to do them in Europe, then they will say, on your bike, tomorrow we have a conversation with the Chinese or the Americans.
I agree with you there, but I think we shouldn't just support the projects that, are not high standards or have problems with community. What I think we can do, I do agree, we shouldn't just come and say, look, we have a law in Europe, you do this. What we should say, look, we bring the money and expertise and assistance to make sure that your, for example, water treatment facility with this mine is better, to make sure that you are doing much better waste treatment, so you're drying the tailings. So actually coming with real support, right, and money, as well as our high requirements. But I think today it would still take too long for all of these like-minded partners to agree one environmental standard. We have some great ones like Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, but ultimately, in the short term, we should just be very very strategic, a little bit more like the Americans, who is in, who's out, based on geopolitics, right?
Well, that's the pragmatism that Carney is calling for. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, of course. We have identified 13 strategic projects as Europe outside of the EU borders. Some of those projects are really good. I know some of these projects actually quite well. For example, the project in South Africa on rare earths with Frontier Rare Earths is a company there. That's actually a project where the local communities absolutely want to have the project. They have the permits. They are talking to the European institutions, but they don't get anything done really. So it's a perfect project that is really wished for by the local people. They're actually angry with the company that they haven't started yet. It's the opposite of what we see in Europe. But somehow Europe is not capable of getting a deal done and getting the actual work being
and
done.
that's a big problem, not being able to get it done. And I think it requires just a shift in mentality almost. Because if you look at the detail, there is actually a program, Global Gateway, right, where there is money. And ultimately, it can be used exactly for this kind of projects. But that program sits in a different department from the industry department, which is obviously in the strategic projects, right? So how can we bring it all together so it works? And, the last person on the planet, I am the last person on the planet to be a supporter of Trump, but he can get it right. He can get this stuff through this entire government machine to be like, right, support this project, do this, do that. Whether we agree with the outcome, he can get stuff done. And we need a little bit of that in Europe.
Well, in Europe, we see mainly strategic misalignment. We live and we think and we work and we act in silos. So silos in the sense that we have separated parts of the supply chain which are not connected to each other, but also silence in policy making. We have, even within the European Commission, you have different institutions that are doing things on the one side, and on the other side of the same organization is doing exactly the opposite. So there is no alignment of the strategy. And that's because we are organized in that way. It's a very difficult system because it's structurally designed to actually make things slower. Whereas in Trump and in the case of China, we see this engineering approach where you just have a top-down strategy where the leader decides this is going to happen. Now, it's obvious that we do not want to go in that direction.
We don't want that.
And I fully agree with Mark Carney, who says we need to be principled, but also pragmatic. And I think that's the shift we need in Europe and also in Canada and Australia. We're very principled. We're very good in being principled, yes, and we have to keep that. Yeah. But we somehow have to find a European answer or a Canadian answer to also becoming more pragmatic and getting things done in reality, because the Chinese are not waiting for us. They're digging while we are talking.
But I do think this penny has dropped, and there's lots and lots of people, really smart, fantastic people within the, for example, cabinets of commissioners who get this and are trying to do that. So it might take time, but I think we're in the right trajectory. But may I just say here, I think the global story, right? So the working with like-minded partners, it is just one part of it for Europe, though. There's so much more that Europe can and should do itself here in Europe that we're missing.
Well, absolutely, because let's be honest, the last decades we have decarbonized in Europe, but what people do not really grasp is that most of that decarbonization has been there because we have deindustrialized. We have basically exported our moral, social, environmental responsibility for doing the hardcore industrial production of critical raw materials, the mining, the processing, the refining. We've exported that to elsewhere. So we've asked other parts of the world, the global south mainly, to do those things for us. And we just wanted to import the nice, refined intermediates or final products. So that's a kind of externalization of our moral obligation. So I think it's clear that we need more made in Europe, mining, refining, extraction, refining processes, recycling processes. And that's, of course, where we see the social legitimacy of being able to do that is really difficult in Europe.
But before we go to social legitimacy, I think that the first point is, yes, we outsourced it for sure, but it's also that others, like China, were smart enough to put fantastic industrial policy in place to onshore that while we were outsourcing, right? We just don't have those policies.
Oh, you mentioned the word industrial policy. This is something that was actually something you were not allowed to mention in Europe.
Unless you are French, but yes, indeed. And I think this is really, and we're talking about it again now a lot, but we're still not doing, right? I mean, ultimately, we have a few options. So we would either need to have a strong investment policy to support making stuff in Europe. In the last year, we tried with European state aid, with various funds. It didn't really work. So the money, not fully there. Maybe by 2028, 2029, if we have anyone to give the money to at that point. That's one thing. Money is not there. The second thing then we go to is a more protectionist policy, right? So really using our trade policy to really make sure that actually we need to basically protect Europe.
Because we've been extremely naive in our open trade policies.
WTO, right? I say we should replace a T with an H because it's who? Who is WTO?
Exactly.
So that we didn't do. So we do. It's fantastic. We've announced and we have electric vehicle tariffs. I think it's good, but we need to go a lot more in the supply chain. What about batteries, for example? So that's another bit. And the final bit, we call it a transport environment as by Europe. We still do not require, even when we use public money, to buy local, right? We're literally the last region left that doesn't have local content requirements.
We have a brilliant example in the country where I'm active, in Belgium here. We had this public procurement by our public bus company who were trying to buy electric buses. And they organized the system in such a way that it was basically 75% of the actual score was determined by price. So obviously the European bus companies could not compete with the Chinese bus company. So that was designed in advance in such a way that they wanted to buy as many as possible Chinese electric buses rather than support the EU or even Belgian electric bus companies. And that's a great example of how naive we are and how the short-term vision is really terrible, because we really need to look at this in the long term. If we do not safeguard our industrial bases in Europe, then the Chinese will have us for breakfast. And furthermore, we will also see that we have a radical deindustrialization, we'll lose jobs, and the extreme right will further rise.
No, absolutely. I mean, the reality is that's the public procurement law today, right? You have to look at the price. But this is being changed, right? So right now in Brussels, we're all busy working on the so-called Industrial Accelerator Act, right? And potentially it can be huge. It can really introduce those made-in-EU requirements, but we really need them for things like batteries. We don't need them for tires or wheels. And as it goes in Brussels, I think at the moment we are kind of just in a bit of a Christmas tree discussion, right? How to do this, but it's not yet there, right? So you're right. Ultimately, if we don't have any of this and we don't build stuff here, it's a really fruitful ground for, indeed, the far right, the right-wing politicians and activists to take this space and to take this debate, because it's true. Ultimately, today, when we do subsidize an electric vehicle, a lot of that money actually does support manufacturing in China. And by the way, I just want to really stress, I am not in any shape or form against, Chinese batteries or electric vehicles or supply chain. I think there's fantastic know-how there, expertise, they're great products. What we want is for them to be made here in Europe. It doesn't matter the nationality so much.
But not just as screwdriver plants.
No, absolutely not absolutely not assembly plant. Real know-how, real sharing of expertise here, because today we probably need to learn from them. Them, South Koreans, wherever it might be.
There is another domain where I believe we're actually more advanced than the Chinese, and that is in the technology to produce green steel. And that's also extremely big case in Europe at the moment. On the one hand, we're trying to evolve towards green steel production. We have a lot of European research projects that are trying to develop these hydrogen-based steel-making technologies. But as long as we need to compete with Chinese steel that is high carbon, that is a high CO2 footprint, but that comes at a very low cost and is imported here in Europe, then of course this green steel cannot come to fruition. And that's another dilemma, another paradox that we see, that we are so naive so far in trying to get that done.
Yeah, green steel would be critical. And I do think here the automotive industry is quite important. Automotive industry today in Europe buys a lot of steel. So if they actually were required to purchase European green steel for all of their cars, we would create a massive lead market.
And they don't want to do that, of course. They want to buy cheap steel, and that's again
Exactly.
the example of the silo policy, the structural misalignment. It's all everybody needs to fend for themselves, basically. Every single country, every single company needs to fend for themselves, but there is no structural alignment to look at the whole system, and that is, of course, the brilliant strategy of the Chinese, who have worked on this vertical integration basis for decades, and look where they are at this moment. But let's look at the critical raw materials targets as well, because this will be central in our podcast episodes in the future. Europe has set itself ambitious targets for 2030. So let's look at these 3 targets for domestic mining, domestic recycling, and domestic processing. What is your take on the first one, domestic mining? 10% by 2030.
It's a tough one. It's a really tough one. Look, I think we do have some really good projects and resources across Europe. We don't, not every resource, I think globally, but we do have a few quite good ones. Ideally, I believe we can do that in an environmentally and socially sustainable way. I believe most technology to do it is there, it's just about really applying it. And there are some fantastic new projects, they do everything right. So we can meet the target, but you cannot take out of the equation the fact that there are people who don't want it, right? It's a tricky one because, of course, we need those materials. We need to understand, that 10 people somewhere cannot block the project. But at the same time, if there is a genuine protest, you can't go again. You cannot build a mine if people don't want it. It's just not going to last, right?
Well, we've seen that in Serbia with the massive protests against that project. Yeah, this is probably one where you just have to accept people really don't want it. We can discuss about the reasons why they don't want it. We can discuss about the politicization of that resistance to that project. But in reality, I mean, it's just so difficult.
Yeah.
Luckily,
you can do a lot to work with people from the beginning. You can do a lot for a genuine, kind of bringing everyone on board. But at some point, if it's a no, you just cannot do. Sometimes it's a real blocker, and you cannot unblock it.
But I have the impression there is some kind of invisible block to mining projects in Europe. In most parts of the European Union, we see that this resistance is cultural, it's emotional, it's deep-rooted, and I don't see how we're going to overcome it by 2030, because let's not forget, in theory, we need to open several new mines in Europe to meet those 10% targets.
Of course.
But as far as I know, the only new mine that has opened recently, in fact, it happened just in February 2026, is the Keliber lithium mine in Finland. That's one of the first few actual critical metal mines that has opened in Europe. And maybe we should look at how they have done it, because they have a public support for that project. The communities want it.
Yes, but generally it's quite interesting because there's quite a few mines in the north where there has been the active mining industry for a long time. There is less protest, there's less acceptance, there's, a lot more. And there's a lot more other regions where mining hasn't been happening for a long time, or new mines haven't opened, where you have a lot more protest. So there's also something there, learning by being and by seeing. Oh. But of course there are other targets, right? I believe the mining one is the hardest one, right? In my view, strategically speaking, from the point of geopolitics added value, the most important target is the processing one. So we need to make sure that we process and refine a lot more minerals.
40% domestically.
Exactly, a lot. That's a lot. That is a lot, but we can do it. We can do it. It's not about, the actual mining or where the minerals come from. It's really about those expertise to refine, to process, to clean things up. And here, it's really about industrial policy. You need to get industrial policy right. If you don't have that refining step in Europe, the stakes are super high, because you're also not going to have recycling. You're not going to recycle if you don't have anyone to send your recycled metal to. It's just going to go to China. So that middle step, in my view, is the most critical.
But it also brings us to the third target, 25% recycling. As environmentalists, both you and me, we radically agree that we should maximize all opportunities to keep all the critical metals that we have imported in final products, keep them here and recycle them. battery recycling, which will be a key topic in our podcast for the next time, is essential. But the hardcore industrial reality is that all the big industry players in Europe, Umicore, BASF, Aurubis, Solvay, they've all benched their plants to recycle batteries because there simply is no feed to recycle because we're leaking the feed to China. It's actually being exported to China, who buy it all from us. We have no offtake, so even if we would recycle, our recycled products will not find companies buying the recycled products because there is no midstream for PCAM and CAM production, or hardly any PCAM CAM production for cathode active materials in Europe. And thirdly, the economics just don't weigh up. So the business case for battery recycling is not there. So this is a typical example, a typical dilemma, a typical paradox where we see, yes, we should do it. We have the expertise, the technology, and the companies to do it, but we're not doing it in reality.
And ironically, a lot of those barriers you mentioned can all be solved right now with policy. We can place export restrictions on battery feed.
Export ban,
Exactly.
simple.
Export bans, fully agree. We can also, when it comes to the offtake, the demand, we can simply make sure that our electric vehicle targets as agreed for car makers by 2030, by 2035 are there. If they're there, you have business for battery gigafactories here. If you have battery gigafactories here, you have the whole supply chain to be the offtake for recycling. It all starts with that one policy we already have, but right now we're trying to weaken, right? So a lot of this can be solved with good policy. None of these are structural barriers that can be overcome. And yet, here we are. And I'm really looking forward to the episode about recycling, because I think there's big potential for an economy like Europe.
Lots of stuff to talk about, that's clear.
Raw Matters.
As you can see, today we had our pilot episode with just 2 of the seats filled. From next time onwards, we'll have a 3rd seat, and we're going to invite leading voices from around the world, from the quadruple helix, so industry, policymakers, journalists, civil society, trade unions, environmental organizations. So we really want to be inclusive and invite lots of different people, leading voices in the field to hear their reflections. Because, Julia, we have a lot of things to talk about, but sometimes you also need to ask a third opinion.
Absolutely. I think the idea is really to have some of the leading experts in the field, be it around geopolitics, battery recycling, industrial policy, minerals, extraction, refining, etc., global dimension, to really delve into some of these issues, hopefully find some really interesting answers, and hopefully serve as a basis for some of the critical political discussions happening right now in Brussels.
And we absolutely need to educate also policymakers in an actionable way so that they can actually do something with it and get from words into real action, because we can have another meeting about having the need for more action, but that's not going to help us. We really need to move forward. Thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to the next episodes, and we'll have some brilliant conversations.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for all the viewers for watching this first episode of our Raw Matters podcast. Please follow us on our YouTube page, on our LinkedIn company page, where you can follow all the news. We also want to be inclusive in terms of getting your opinions, getting your suggestions. So if you have any questions, any remarks, or any suggestions about new speakers or new topics, or you want to ask a question to one of the speakers that we will announce, please do so. Leave the information in the comment section in our LinkedIn channel, or send us an email. We look forward to your interaction. Thank you very much for watching.
This episode of Raw Matters was made possible with co-funding from SimSquare KU Leuven and the Horizon Europe Framework, including the H2 Plasma Red and Lithos projects, and is produced by Storyrunner. Be sure to subscribe to Raw Matters on YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn and your favorite podcast platform to catch future episodes.